good morning or good afternoon, depending where you all are. Let me get a couple of things set up before I begin, just so that I make sure I don't take up too much time. And then I do want to start my stopwatch so that, like I said, I'll know hopefully how long everything is going. Well, last week I know that everybody here was here for Saturday and Sunday services celebrating something that God began to do with the people of God in a new way back in the New Testament church. And today I want to go back even further than that and go back to the beginning of everything. To introduce this topic, let me talk about a little bit of background on our recent history. In the Age of Enlightenment, which was back in the 1700s, there was a time of great advancements in science and human knowledge. People began to look at how they could view the world around them. They began to concentrate on the five senses and what could be discerned by humanity of the world around them. And it was also a time when people began to question the orthodoxy of the Catholic Church, which was the power of that time. Great thinkers began to question their dogma in favor of human reasoning and empirical knowledge, as I mentioned. Names such as Rousseau, Voltaire, and Locke. The very existence of a God who had placed his fingerprints on the creation was questioned at the highest levels of society. And of course, this led to the validity of the Holy Bible being brought into question. It had to be destroyed, or at the very least, devalued by those who wanted to advance their human reasoning and have the rule of the culture of the day. In the beginning, the first words of Genesis 1 are the words God inspired to be written as our introduction to him and his plan for this planet we call Earth. Yet the truth behind these words and the very existence of a God who orders the affairs of men has been questioned since societies began to form within the human race. The scriptures themselves predicted this skepticism and outright unbelief. Let's turn over to 2 Peter. 2 Peter 3. 2 Peter 3. And we'll read verses 5 and 6. And I apologize, I'm not accustomed to speaking in front of a camera, so if I'm a little uncomfortable, please forgive me. But I'm just not used to having this out in front of me, but I'll try to adapt. 2 Peter chapter 3, and here Peter talked about this kind of attitude that would exist in the world. Verse 5, for this they willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. And the verse talks about the Greek behind this, willfully, is the words choose, or they wanted this ignorance. It wasn't like just something that just happened to go over the top of their head. It was something they chose to be ignorant of. And in today's world, it's even harder to justify an ignorance of a creator, as we see all the things the detail of the world around us. Let's turn over to Romans 1. Romans 1 also talks about this attitude, this mindset that would be in our world. And I want to read this to you from the complete Jewish Bible. And I think it kind of brings out the meaning a little bit more in this passage. Romans chapter 1 and verse 18. What is revealed is God's anger from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who in their wickedness keep suppressing the truth. Because what is known about God is plain to them, since God has made it plain to them. For ever since the creation of the universe, his invisible qualities, both his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly seen, because they can be understood from what he has made. Therefore they have no excuse. Because although they know who God is, they do not glorify him as God or thank him, On the contrary, they have become futile in their thinking, and their undiscerning hearts have become darkened. Claiming to be wise, they have become fools. How about the here and now? Do we truly realize that every word that God inspired to be written is inspired by Him? How would our belief system be affected without the foundational verses found within Genesis? Many modern churches today downplay the meaning behind these accounts in the book of Genesis. Some even try to discredit much of the history we find in the Old Testament, only willing to base their core beliefs on the New Testament scriptures as they try to fit in to our increasingly humanistic, secular society. Again, I ask, how would our belief system as we know it be affected without these foundational verses? I'd like to quote a couple of sources for you of how this attitude is in the world today. From an article entitled Genesis, History or Parable, from the website christiananswers.net. Quote, "The much debated first 11 chapters of Genesis have incurred the most criticism from modern scholars, scientists, and skeptics. Proposals of proper interpretation have included looking at these chapters as poetry, parables, prophecy, letters, biography, or autobiographical personal testimony," end quote. As part of their Counterpoint series, Zondervan has published a book titled Genesis, History, Fiction, or Neither. 3 views are presented on the Bible's earliest chapters. It lays out 3 views on the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Number 1, an accurate history of the beginning of humanity that should be taken literally. Number 2, a proto-history that addresses origins, illustrates important social and theological principles, and sets paradigms for our later understanding of reality, but may not be a realistic representation of actual events. Number 3, fiction. There was no garden, no 2 trees, no serpent who talked to Eve. Also, the flood never occurred either. These first 11 chapters are nothing but myth, legend, and tale that are just fiction. Isn't it fascinating that there's such a wide range of belief, even within the Christian world, of how we are to view the early chapters of Genesis, and that 2 out of 3 of the views don't take Genesis 1 to 11 literally? Let's narrow this down even further, because we won't have time to talk about the first 11 chapters today. I don't think Scott wants me to go that long, but let's narrow it down to the first 3 chapters. What if we didn't have the first 3 chapters? Or we just didn't believe they were accurate, they were just some fairy tales that God decided to include in the Bible? What would we have without them? Let's consider. I would like to talk about some of these. If you'll go ahead and turn your Bible to Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1. And we'll go through and just summarize some of what we have here in the first chapter. But let's take a few minutes and look at this. As we do this, I want you to consider what core teachings that we get from these first 3 chapters that we would have to throw away if we didn't have these verses, or if we downplayed the literal nature of them. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. How much time and energy and lives have been wasted just trying to disprove that first verse? How much just energy? Just think about it. All these great people in the 1800s and 1700s that gave their lives to disproving just that first verse, not accepting that God was the creator of the heavens and the earth. And then we go on and we see that God created light on the first day and the firmament, and then he goes on and the second day and creates the dry land. And notice several times through this first chapter we see after God had created something, he said it was good. It was good. He repeats that several times. If we move over to the creation of mankind, let's go to verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And at the end of that section, of that sixth day, it points out that God saw everything he had made, and indeed it was very good. Not just it was good, it was very good. Let's look at a quote I'd like to read you a little section out of the Bullinger's Bible. They have some appendices in the back of the Bible. I don't know if you've ever had one of these, but there's quite a lot of information. But in the back, they actually have an appendix. And the name of the appendix is Genesis, the Foundation of Divine Revelation. And I just want to read a little section out of this to kind of support this point that I want to make today. Quote, "Genesis is the seed plot of the whole Bible. It is essential to the true understanding of its every part. It is the foundation on which divine revelation rests and on which it is built up. It is not only the foundation of all truth, but it enters into and forms part of all subsequent inspiration." The article goes on to point that Genesis is quoted actually 60 times in the New Testament. So what are some of the core teachings? Let's talk about some of the core teachings that we have just in Genesis 1 to 3. First of all, we've already discussed, God is presented to us in these verses as the creator and designer of all that we see. Without a firm belief in the veracity of these verses, we lose this core teaching from these chapters. And we see it all around us in the world today. Despite all of the evidence to the contrary, this world still wants to believe in evolution. It still does not want to accept God as a creator of all that we see. Let's look at a verse. And I had to really narrow this down because there's so many verses we could look at. But let's go look at Job 38. Job 38. This is one we would have to rip out if we don't believe in God as the creator. Job 38 and verse 4. "Where were you," he's speaking to Job, "where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it?" Nope, we can't have that verse because God didn't create everything, right? God's design and his attention to detail, as I said, is seen all around us. The creation is orderly and thoughtfully designed by a mind so much greater than ours. You begin to study into some of these things and you come away just amazed and astounded and realizing how low we are compared to God when we look at what he has done around us. So Genesis 1 presents us with a creator who actually likes his creation. He likes what he did. This is before Facebook came around. God liked what he did. Isn't that nice? It was very good, he said. Here's another verse we have to take away, Psalm 33. Psalm 33, verse 6. This is one of my favorite passages in the Psalms. There's many, but this is one that really stands out to me because of how it presents God and how it presents his power. Psalm 33, verse 6. "By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. He gathers the waters together He gathers the waters of the sea together as a heap. He lays up the deep in the storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him." There's not a lot of awe that we see in our societies today, is there, of God? "For he spoke, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast." Here we see the great power of God presented where he spoke, and it happened. It's something man has been trying to imitate for a long time. We're beginning sort of to get to that point, although it's a really small thing that we can now talk to these devices and we can speak and these things will do things. but nothing on the scale of what God did. Nothing at all. They might make a phone call for you. They might add a calendar appointment for you. But are they going to make dinner for you? No. That's still, you got to still do that. But that's the kind of power we're trying to get to, and we'll never get there. We'll never get to that point. As I said, there's probably dozens or probably even hundreds of verses we have to throw out of the Bible if we don't literally believe in Genesis 1 to 3. And what would we be exchanging our great Creator God for? That all this happened by chance. Nothing was purposeful or designed by anyone, but just evolved by random chance. That's the choice. We either have a Creator God who loves what He did, or this just happened. You just happen to have this amazing body and this amazing digestive system. Just look at the human body. Look at everything about it. You take one part of it and study it deeply, and you're amazed. And that's just one piece of the human body. So that's what we lose. Let's talk about another important concept that we get from God as our Creator. And I just want to go through quickly because I see that I'm already running through a lot of time. So let's look at Jesus Christ and the importance. And as we know, the Bible presents Him as the actual Creator of the heavens and the earth. And we see that in John chapter 1. John chapter 1 and verse 1. It says, in the beginning, here's another in the beginning, and this is way before Genesis, was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through Him. And without Him, nothing was made that was made. So we see Jesus Christ here as our Creator. And why is that important, that He's the Creator? Let's look at Colossians 1. And I just want to go quickly through this. If you write it down, I've already had it in my notes, but if you write it down, Colossians 1 and verse 15, the writer of Paul is talking here about Jesus Christ. And he says, He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by Him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions. And everything let's drop down to verse 17. He is before all things, and in Him all things consist. And then He's presented as the head of the church, the firstborn of the dead, that in all things He may have the preeminence. For it pleased the Father that in Him all the fullness should dwell. And by Him, here's the important point, by Him to reconcile all things to Himself, whether things on earth or things in heaven, having made peace through the blood of His cross. Christ, as our Creator, is also seen as worthy to be the Redeemer of all the creation. That's pretty important, isn't it? Pretty important to lose that fact if you don't believe in creation. Let's move on. How about the concept of family? Family. In Genesis 1 and the first 3 chapters, we are presented with Adam, and then we see Eve. And we see that a family was created. We are told that Adam was created first, and then God created a companion, Eve. So we have the concept of family, we have the concept of marriage that we get from this very foundational section of the Bible. And we see that there are two, let me show my fingers, 2 genders, not 57, not 75. I don't know how many the count is up to now, that the genders are there. But we see 2, only 2. The concept was central to God's plan for humanity. As we're told later on in the book of Malachi, and I'll refer you to this verse, Malachi 2, verse 14 and 15, God tells us here that He is upset with divorce. And why? Because He wants godly offspring. So His whole point of making that family back in Genesis was to build godly offspring for His family. And that leads us into the next concept. So we have God as Creator, we have marriage, we have family. Man is created in the image of God. We are told that various creatures were created after their kind, and we didn't read it in detail, but if you go back and read Genesis 1, you'll see this was created after this kind. Well, we're told that man was created in the image of God in His likeness. Our bodies were made to look like Him, though limited at the current time on this physical plane of existence. So human beings are special in God's creation. And Genesis 1 is what points this out. Each one of these points could be expanded to a full sermon. Let's move on. This is something that I didn't pick up on the first reading of this section, but the use of language. If you think about what's happening in the interactions that occur in these 3 chapters, the use of language indicates advanced levels of intelligence in Adam and Eve. They understood what God was saying to them. Were they just like animals, or were they just a little above animals, or were they just like little babies? Like some people think that, yeah, of course, yes, we probably can imagine they were a little bit naive, that they didn't have a lot of experience. But I feel that God gave them intelligence. He didn't create a low IQ Adam or a low IQ Eve. He created probably some of the best intelligence that we've ever seen in these 2 human beings, because these were the beginnings of what human beings were going to be. Adam was created with the ability to communicate on a very high level with God. He names all the animals. He understands when God tells him, hey, if you eat of that tree over there, you're going to die. Now, would God say that if Adam didn't understand it? Would God hold him accountable if he didn't understand it? No, we know that. He understands that Eve was taken from his own body and that they're now a family unit. So I believe that those very interactions that we see indicate high levels of intelligence and capability in Adam and Eve. What else? How about the Sabbath? The day that we're celebrating here right now. In Genesis 2, we see that God set apart a very special day. The account tells us he rested on this day and set it apart. And Moses refers back to this. He actually talks about this in the 10 Commandments, which I guess we have to get rid of that commandment if we don't believe in Genesis 1. But in Exodus 20 and verse 11, Moses says this, For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Now many people will say, well, Genesis never talks about the Sabbath. It never mentions Sabbath in there. But here we have our cross-reference to what God was doing on that very special day. So I guess, like I said, we have to take this out because there's no creation and there's no chapter 2 of Genesis, right? It's just myth and fable. Well, let's move on. What about the story of Eve and her encounter with the serpent in chapter 3? Here we are introduced to the former archangel who tried to oppose God's plan and was defeated. God allowed Adam and Eve to be tempted. Satan, later described by Christ as the father of lies, lies to Eve, and she made a choice. She made a choice to disobey God. Here we see, presented to us in this foundational set of verses, the concept of sin, the existence of Satan, the existence of free moral agency, and the consequences of sin. We saw the consequences of what happened to Adam and Eve. God did not force mankind to obey him. He wanted a relationship based on love, which obedience would come naturally from that relationship. God gives us the privilege of making a choice. He doesn't give us the privilege of determining a different outcome of what that choice will entail. So he doesn't give us that choice. That's already set. Without this account in Genesis 3, we lose valuable insights into the origin of sin and Satan's involvement in this world. We lose this example of free moral agency in action and the consequences of sin. So far, we've covered at least 9 foundational concepts that are found in just the first 3 chapters of Genesis. But we are not done. There's more. And I'll try to see what I can cover in my remaining minutes here. God tells mankind that he created them to have dominion. This is in Genesis 1 and verse 28. He tells them, this is after their creation. He says, then God blessed them in verse 28. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So man is given a role of rulership over God's creation. He's not just another one of the creatures, which is what the evolutionary concept would have you believe. He's not just another creature that's managed to somehow get up to the top of the chain over all the other creatures, and now we're in control. This is a view we see preached by many of these animal conservationists and nature conservationists. They say, well, you're just another creature on this planet. You don't have the right to cut down that tree. And what right do you have to have a cow and kill it and have meat and steak from it, or milk? Or like for me, they would point at me and say, how do you have the right to have these chickens in your backyard and gather their eggs and eat their eggs? They didn't give you permission, right? That's their viewpoint, is, they have as many rights as we do. We're just another part of the tree of creatures. No, God says man has dominion. He gave man control and rulership over the planet. And that is in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. So we have also a very special prophecy given to us in Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. And most scholars agree that this passage points to the birth, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Genesis 3 verse 15, God says, this is after Adam and Eve had taken of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He says in verse 15, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Here we see the seed, and in many translations the seed is uppercase S, as the translators understood this to refer to Jesus Christ. Here's what the Believer's Bible Commentary says on this verse. Quote 3:15. The verse 15 switches to the devil himself. This verse is known as the Proto-Evangelium, meaning the first gospel. It predicts the perpetual hostility between Satan and the woman representing all of mankind, and between Satan's seed, his agents, and her seed, the Messiah. The woman's seed would crush the devil's head, a mortal wound spelling utter defeat. This wound was administered at the cross when the Savior decisively triumphed over the devil. Satan in turn would bruise the Messiah's heel. The heel wound here speaks of suffering and even of physical death, but not of ultimate defeat. So Christ suffered on the cross and even died, but he arose from the dead, victorious over sin, hell, and Satan. End quote. So at the very beginning, as God is punishing Adam and Eve, he's also giving them a message of hope. The hope of the gospel is given to them even as they're being sent out of the Garden of Eden. Again, another foundational concept we would lose if we did not have a belief in the literal verses that we find in Genesis 1 through 3. That these are literally history that God preserved and brought down and gave to us. Today, we have focused on just the first 3 chapters of the book of Genesis. And I would bet that if you would take your Bibles and go and look at the first 3 chapters, you would probably find more things that I didn't mention. You would probably find more foundational concepts here that are throughout the Bible. As it says in the Bullinger's commentary, this is the seed plot for the whole Bible. Everything we find here is spread throughout the whole Bible. And you cannot just rip out the first 3 or even the first 11, or even, as some try to do, they take away the whole Old Testament. They don't want to even look at the Old Testament as valid or anything. Today we've talked about these concepts, and we've seen, as I said, 11 foundational concepts presented in these chapters. The events found in these verses have been correlated by Jesus Christ himself. The one who actually did the creating has told us that these events are accurately portrayed in the pages of Genesis. We've seen today that so many other scriptures fail to make sense without understanding them as authentic, literal, historical record of what happened. We believe Adam and Eve existed. We believe they were created in the image of God, and we believe they were given dominion by their Creator and used by Him to start the human family on this earth. And we believe that Jesus Christ, as Creator, is our worthy Redeemer of all sin, of every sin that has ever been committed. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and God saw everything He had made, and indeed, it was very good.